James had always seen his life as a picture of steadiness and achievement. After 22 years of marriage to Linda, he was convinced they had created a strong bond built on love and trust. Linda seemed to embody everything he could wish for in a spouse: devoted, compassionate, and a wonderful mother to their two children, Sarah, aged 18, and Luke, aged 15. Together, they appeared to be the quintessential American family, free from the troubles that so often affected others. Then, there was Mark. James's closest friend since their college days, Mark shared with him countless milestones that forged a deep, enduring friendship. That's why a seemingly innocent remark from Linda one evening at home shouldn't have stood out. They were enjoying dinner when she jokingly mentioned, almost laughing, "It feels like I have 3 husbands, you, Mark, and Fate." James chuckled, brushing it off. However, as he later sat alone in his office, the comment lingered in his mind. Why include Mark? Why did the joke feel so misplaced? He tried to dismiss the thought, but it clung to him like a splinter. As days passed, James began noticing details that had previously escaped his attention. Conversations between Linda and Mark, which had once seemed casual and lighthearted, now carried an undertone he couldn't define. They shared private jokes that he didn't get, exchanged messages during family gatherings, and even at social events, Mark seemed to gravitate more toward Linda than to his own wife, Emily. "It's all in your head," James reassured himself, attributing these observations to mere coincidences. Yet, the idea began to grow, taking root in his thoughts like a creeping vine. The situation escalated during one of Linda's business trips, which were a normal part of her role as a project coordinator for a multinational corporation. This time, however, something felt off. Coincidentally, Mark was also traveling for work, and both were headed to the same city, far from home. Suspicious, James confronted Linda, who laughed lightly and said, "Coincidences happen, James. Don't be ridiculous." Her easy dismissal should have eased his mind, but it only deepened his unease. One evening, while Linda was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Mark appeared. "Did you manage to resolve that at work?" It was a harmless-sounding question, but when Linda quickly deleted the notification, James felt an icy knot of suspicion tighten. Why delete it if it was so innocent? Doubt began to consume James, a man who had once trusted Linda and Mark without question. Now, every interaction, every smile, and every word seemed tainted. He knew he couldn't act recklessly, as that might destroy everything, but he also realized he wouldn't find peace without answers. Determined, James embarked on a secret investigation. He started by discreetly installing cameras and microphones in key areas of their home, concealing them in bookshelves and decorative items. Reviewing the footage yielded nothing unusual, just the routine of a happy family. Linda managed the household, cared for the kids, and worked in her office. Mark, when he visited, behaved as a friendly guest, relaxed and affable. Frustrated by the lack of evidence, James expanded his search. He scrutinized their shared bank accounts, meticulously combing through transactions. An extravagant dinner at a fancy restaurant and flowers sent to an unnamed recipient caught his attention, but these could be explained as gifts for colleagues or clients. Yet the nagging feeling persisted. Next, James examined Linda's phone records. The frequency of her calls with Mark surprised him, especially since Mark wasn't part of her work circle. Still, the calls were brief and could easily be dismissed as trivial. Delving into her emails revealed nothing but work-related correspondence, shopping confirmations, and school updates for their children. It was as if Linda knew how to cover her tracks, if there were any to hide. Sleepless nights became the norm as James replayed every detail in his mind. Driven to extremes, he decided to use DNA tests on Sarah and Luke under the guise of exploring their family heritage. The kids eagerly participated, and Linda didn't suspect anything. When the results arrived, they shattered James's world. The reports confirmed an unthinkable truth. Sarah and Luke were not his biological children. The revelation struck like a thunderclap. For years, he had loved and protected them, believing they were his own. The possibility that Mark was their father ignited a storm of rage and betrayal. James reread the reports, searching for an error, but the results were undeniable. Everything now seemed to fit. Linda's interactions with Mark, their shared laughter, the bond he had once dismissed as mere friendship. That night, James resolved to confront the situation. He planned carefully, knowing anger alone wouldn't suffice. Using the pretext of celebrating his and Linda's wedding anniversary, he organized a dinner with Linda, Mark, and Emily. It was the perfect opportunity to unmask the truth. Dressed sharply and appearing calm, James set the stage. Linda, thrilled by the anniversary gesture, was unsuspecting. Mark arrived with Emily, smiling and bearing flowers. The dinner began like any other gathering of close friends, filled with laughter and nostalgic stories. For a fleeting moment, James felt he might be wrong, that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. But the anger and pain simmered beneath the surface, a relentless reminder of the betrayal he believed was unfolding before his eyes. After dinner, Emily excused herself to retrieve something from the car, leaving James, Linda, and Mark alone in the dining room. With an unnerving composure, James rose, shut the door, and turned to face them. "There's something we need to address," he began, his voice carrying an intensity that froze Linda and Mark in place. He pulled a set of papers from his pocket and slid them across the table. "Do you recognize these?" he asked sharply. Linda's face went pale as her eyes widened in horror. Mark, puzzled, looked at the documents, struggling to grasp the situation. "James, what is this?" he asked, attempting to maintain a calm tone. "It's the truth," James replied, as he revealed a gun from a concealed compartment. He placed it on the table, not aiming it, but leaving no doubt about his control of the situation. The room fell into a deafening silence. Linda began to tremble, her voice failing as she searched for words. Mark's face drained of color, his eyes fixed on the weapon. Leaning forward, James locked eyes with Linda. "I want the truth. No more lies, no more half-truths. Who's going to start?" His tone wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that shattered any resistance. Linda stammered, attempting to deny everything, but James slammed his hand on the table, cutting her off. "Don't play games with me, Linda. I know and I have proof." He turned to Mark, whose lips moved soundlessly, incapable of forming a response. "You were my friend, Mark, my brother. Why did you do this?" James picked up the gun, holding it firmly but still not pointing it at anyone. "I should end this now," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I'm not like you. I don't destroy the people I care about. So here's your chance. One of you can walk away, but only if you confess everything. The other..." He left the threat hanging in the air. Linda and Mark exchanged glances filled with despair. The weight of the moment bore down on them, crushing any hope of escape. Time ticked by, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. James sat motionless, his gaze shifting between the two, his expression unyielding. Linda broke the silence first, her sobs turning into gasping cries. "James, please, I love you. I never wanted it to come to this. It was a mistake." James raised his hand abruptly, silencing her. "Stop. I don't want excuses. I want the truth, from the very beginning. No deflections." His voice was soft, yet it struck like thunder, his eyes piercing with cold fury. Taking a deep breath, Linda steadied herself enough to speak. "It was years ago. I was lonely. You were always working, and Mark was... around." Her voice faltered, but she pressed on. "It started with conversations. I felt invisible, and he made me feel seen, heard. But I never wanted to betray you, James. I swear I didn't." She glanced at Mark, silently pleading for his support, but he avoided her gaze, his face a mask of guilt. James sat still, his face unreadable. He waited for Linda to continue, offering no reaction. "It was a mistake," she repeated, as though that could justify everything. "It happened once, at first. I tried to stop, I swear, but things spiraled out of control." Mark, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke, his voice low and barely audible. "James, I was weak. I never wanted to hurt you, but it happened. And when it did, we didn't know how to go back." James let out a bitter laugh that echoed in the tense room. "Didn't know how to go back? You had over 20 years to figure it out. 2 children, Mark. 2. His voice rose, but quickly steadied as he took a deep breath. "And yet, you still had the nerve to sit at my table, look me in the eye, and pretend to be part of my family. How do you sleep at night?" Mark attempted to explain, But James cut him off, his anger overflowing. I trusted you, Mark. You were like a brother to me. I shared my life with you, my secrets, my home. And you didn't just betray me. You destroyed my family. You ruined everything. Linda fell to her knees, her pleas spilling out. James, please, I love you. It was a mistake, but it didn't change our family or my love for you. The children are as much yours as mine. Don't let this ruin everything. James's expression remained hard to read. You ruined this family the moment you decided to lie to me. It wasn't just one night, Linda. It was years. Every smile, every moment, every holiday. All of it was a lie. He stood, slipping the gun back into his pocket, though his presence still radiated authority. Do you want to know what happens next? His voice was cold enough to make both Linda and Mark shudder. I've handled everything. Joint accounts, closed, the house, being sold, my investments, out of reach for either of you. He fixed his gaze on Linda. You'll leave with what you brought into this marriage. Nothing more. Mark tried to interject. James, don't do this. Let's resolve this like men, like friends. James laughed again, his disdain palpable. Men? Friends? You've lost the right to use those words. You're not my friend, Mark. You're a traitor. At that moment, Emily returned, carrying a bag from the car. She looked at the three of them, her curiosity piqued. Is everything okay here? She asked, her tone light, but her expression growing concerned. James, still composed, turned to her with a calm smile. Yes, Emily. We were just finishing a conversation. But Emily couldn't miss the tears streaming down Linda's face or Mark's refusal to meet her gaze. She sensed something was deeply wrong. James gestured for her to sit. Emily, I think it's time for you to hear something important. Not from me, but for the sake of the truth. He pulled out a chair, his demeanor steady. Emily, confused but alarmed, sat down, her eyes darting between the others. The storm wasn't over. It was only beginning. James placed the DNA test documents on the table and slid them toward Emily. Read this, he said firmly. You deserve to know the truth. Emily picked up the papers, her eyes scanning the lines faster and faster as the reality sank in. Her breathing grew rapid. What does this mean? She stammered, looking at James in disbelief before turning her gaze to Mark. This has to be a mistake. Mark, please tell me this isn't true. James crossed his arms, his face expressionless, watching the realization dawn on her. It's not a mistake, he stated coldly. This is proof that your husband and my wife not only betrayed us, but lived a lie for years. They had 2 children together while pretending to be loyal to us. Emily turned back to Mark, her eyes brimming with tears. Mark, this can't be real. You wouldn't do this. Not to James, not to me. But Mark's silence spoke volumes, confirming everything. He lowered his head, no longer able to hide behind denial. Emily, I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely audible. I never meant for this to happen. It was a mistake. A moment of weakness. A moment of weakness? Emily shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. You're telling me you destroyed 2 families for a moment of weakness. How many moments were there, Mark? How many times did you lie? To me, to James, to our children? Her glare shifted to Linda, still kneeling on the floor. And you, Linda, I treated you like a sister. How could you do this? How could you ruin everything we had? Linda shook her head, tears streaming down her face as she murmured between sobs. I don't know. James observed the scene unfold, his emotions swirling between a grim sense of vindication and an overwhelming void. Exposing the truth hadn't lessened his pain, but seeing their suffering brought a twisted form of relief. Emily, he said gently, his voice softening. I understand what you're feeling right now. The betrayal, the sense that everything you knew has been ripped away. You don't deserve to live in this lie, just as I didn't. Emily stood abruptly, her movements sharp with anger and despair. I can't stay here. I need air. She ran to the door, leaving James, Linda, and Mark in an oppressive silence. Finally, James broke the stillness, his voice icy. I have nothing more to say to either of you. To me, you're dead, Linda. Our marriage is over. And Mark, he turned his piercing gaze toward him. You will never be my friend again. I'll make sure Sarah and Luke know exactly what kind of person you are. Mark attempted to speak, but James raised his hand, silencing him. Number, I don't want to hear your pathetic excuses. Get out of my house and take your shame with you. Mark hesitated, looking at James's resolute expression, and realized it was futile to argue. He rose slowly and made his way toward the door. Emily stood nearby, trembling, her hands shaking. Emily, please, Mark pleaded. Can we talk? She turned to him, her eyes blazing. Don't talk to me, Mark. I need space. I need to think. As the door shut behind Mark and Emily, James turned back to Linda. And you, he said with disdain. I hope it was worth it because you've lost everything. I've already handled the finances, and this house will be sold. You won't see a penny beyond what you brought into this marriage. It's over. Linda tried to approach him, desperation in her every step. James, please. He stepped back sharply, as though her presence repulsed him. Don't you dare. You chose to betray my trust, and there's nothing more to say. Without another word, James left the room, leaving Linda alone on the floor, consumed by guilt and regret. Outside, he found Emily sitting on the steps, tears streaming down her face. Without speaking, he sat beside her. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken pain. The night was eerily still, save for the whispering wind that seemed to mock their grief. Emily wiped her eyes, her voice a low, strained whisper. James, what do we do now? James sighed, leaning forward with his hands clasped tightly. I don't know, he admitted. I don't think there's anything we can do, except start over. Separately from them, but maybe in some way together. Emily glanced at him, surprised by his words. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but hesitated, unsure of what to say. James noticed her hesitation and continued, his voice gentler. I'm not saying we should force anything, not now, but no one else will understand what we're going through like we do. Maybe, together, we can figure out how to move forward. Emily nodded slowly, unable to form a reply, before their attention was drawn by footsteps behind them. They turned to see Linda standing in the doorway, her face red and swollen from crying. James, she began, her voice trembling. I know you don't want to listen, but please, just give me 1 minute. That's all I ask. James hesitated, but finally motioned for her to continue. Linda descended the steps, stopping a short distance away. I know I've ruined everything, she said, her voice breaking. I know nothing I say can fix what I've done, but I need you to believe me. I never stopped loving you. I made horrible choices, and I'm paying for them. But what we had, it was real. Please don't let this erase the good years we shared. James stared at her for a long moment, his expression unchanging. Maybe it was real for you, he replied, his voice cold. For me, it all feels like a lie now. No matter what you say, your choices destroyed any chance of redemption. I can't forgive you, not now, and maybe not ever. Linda's tears fell freely as she stepped back, his words hitting her like a physical blow. I'm sorry, she whispered before turning and retreating into the house. As the door clicked shut, silence enveloped James and Emily once more. The following day brought an unexpected twist. Back at her home, Emily, consumed by doubt, decided to investigate her own children's medical records. Wanting clarity, she sent DNA samples for confirmation. When the results arrived, they left her reeling. She immediately called James. You need to come here now, she said, her voice urgent but restrained. James arrived shortly after, finding Emily at the kitchen table, papers spread before her. She slid the results toward him without speaking. He picked them up, reading with growing disbelief. This can't be right, he murmured. It's correct, James, Emily said, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. The test is clear. The boys aren't Mark's children. They're yours. James felt his world shift again. How is this possible? He asked, sitting down, the papers trembling in his hands. How can they be mine? Emily shook her head, her face mirroring his confusion. I don't know. I can't explain it. But this changes everything. Not just for us, but for them.